hello everybody. My name is Jo Brotherhood. I'm Head of Economics at Homes England, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our summer learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you have told us are of interest to you. So today's event is how we at Homes England and the department measure social value for economic appraisal. This summer learning programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. So this next slide, the topic of this session is an important focus in Homes England's new strategic plan. These next few slides showed Homes England mission and objectives. Sorry, I've got tongue-tied. The mission was just on the previous slide, and our objectives are set out here as part of our strategic plan. So the next slide summarises who the Local Government Capacity Centre are and what our mission is. We established the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with the whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be delivered. Right, this slide here then on the screen, you will see a breakdown of the session today. So first up, we have Andrew Charlesworth-May. He's the Economic Appraisal Lead at the Department for Levelling Up Homes and Communities, and he'll take you through the updates of the Departmental Appraisal Guide that was just updated in March 2023. We then move on to Andy Wallace, who is our Chief Economist at Homes England, and he'll give you an overview of our economics research programme. Then it's back to me to take you through our first piece of research on measuring the placemaking or wider area impacts of housing-led regeneration. I will then hand over to Will Hardwick, who is a senior economist in the team, who will take you through our Brownfield research and other ongoing research. We will be finishing with a Q&A session, and I will then be drawing the session to a close, assisted by colleagues and running a further poll to get some immediate feedback on the sessions. That feedback is all important to us. So without any further ado, I will now hand over to Andrew Charlesworth-May. Thank you.
Great. OK, so I'm Andrew Charlesworth-May. I'm the DLUC Appraisal Lead, and I'm going to talk to you about the DLUC Appraisal Guide and some changes that we've made to it. I'm going to try and highlight some of those key changes and just give you a general feel for it. So if we go on to the next slide. So the DLUC Appraisal Guide is used to essentially appraise all policies which relate to DLUC. So those might include developments, housing commercial developments. Those might include regeneration and place-based initiatives, or social policies, particularly around local government. So it provides specific advice for DLUC policies. It sits under and is nested within the Green Book. So the Green Book provides the general principles about appraisal and the assessment of value for money across the public sector, and basically we provide the specifics. We also work very, very closely with Homes England, and Homes England essentially have a very active research programme that Andy will talk about later, and a number of elements of that research programme support the appraisal guide and feed directly into the appraisal guide. And the wider area impacts in regeneration areas that is going to be covered later is one of those key areas. So we've recently updated the appraisal guide. It was published on March 31st, and it's been updated to reflect the department's new responsibilities, the fact that it's taken on levelling up and now has essentially a much wider remit than it used to have, and also to incorporate Green Book refresh changes, particularly around the assessment of value for money. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the structure of the appraisal guide and what's in it. So that is the next slide, please. So this sets out the structure of the appraisal guide. So the purple box basically is the contents page from the appraisal guide, And then the blue boxes around the edges are where major updates have been made to the appraisal guide. The appraisal guide itself builds on the 2016 guide, so it tries to develop rather than to totally change the nature of what we had in 2016. So if you are familiar with that 2016 guide, then you'll be familiar with some of the content within the new guide. So running through the contents, we start by talking about the business case model and the role of appraisal within the business case model. Then there's a section on value for money. I'm going to talk about that later. So how to assess value for money and some of the key metrics. So we've updated that to reflect new Green Book guidance. Then there's a section on land value uplift, which is our key market-based measure of the impact of new developments. And then there's a new chapter on the appraisal of place-based initiatives, which reflects our new levelling up duties. We have an updated chapter on assumptions, and then there's a series of technical annexes which go into methods in more detail, in particular land value uplift, and we also talk about assessing additionality and optimism bias and market failures, which are particularly important in regeneration areas, and we give some examples of how to assess those market failures, particularly externalities, using research that Homes England has carried out. So that's the structure of the guide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through three of the key areas. So I'm going to talk about assessing value for money, chapter 3, land value uplift, chapter 4, and then I'm going to talk about the appraisal of place-based initiatives. So if we move on to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, so value for money, obviously, that's a key metric when doing appraisals. We've updated the value for money guidance to reflect new guidance in the Green Book, in particular to emphasise the role of strategic objectives. So if you're looking at options for addressing a problem, and those options don't address your strategic objectives, then effectively the option can't be value for money because you've still got the problem that you started out with. The second thing that we've done is we assess the value for money of interventions using value for money bands. Those allow us to look at both monetised impacts reflected in benefit cost ratios and non-monetised impacts. So what we've done is to refine our approach. So we've increased the number of VFM bands from 4 to 6. So we've split our acceptable band into medium and acceptable, and our high band into high and very high. And that gives us increased granularity, and also it brings us into line with one of our key partners, which is the Department for Transport. We do a lot of joint interventions with them, for example, HIF. So that allows us to effectively be joined up with them. So value for money bands are very important. We use them rather than benefit cost ratios to make assessments of value for money, because they allow us to take into account non-monetised impacts. And effectively what we do is we start by monetising impacts in benefit cost ratios, and then that allows us to get an initial VFM band, and then we use what are called switching values to examine how much benefits would have to change to move us to a different band, and then we look at the magnitudes of non-monetized impacts to assess the degree to which they are likely to enable that shift and move us to a different band. And I've got an example on the next slide. So if you go on to that. Okay, so what we've done is we've tried to be much more consistent in the new guidance about our assessment of non-monetized impacts. So we've introduced a formal approach to assessing them. And what we've done is we've introduced 7 categories, starting at large adverse or large negative or disbenefit to large beneficial or large benefit or positive impacts. And what we do when assessing non-monetized impacts is we look at the direction of the impact. So is it an adverse impact or is it a positive impact? And then we look at the magnitude of the impact. So we've got an example of how we would apply those non-monetized impacts to reach around a solution, around a conclusion about value for money in this slide. So in the example, we start off with an investment which is worth £50 million. We can monetize and we can identify and monetize £90 million worth of benefits, which gives us a benefit cost ratio of 90 million over 50 million, which is 1.8. So that represents median value for money. That's a typo. It should be saying median value for money. If benefits were to get to a high VFM category, we would require a benefit cost ratio of 2. So that requires benefits to increase by 10 million. We assess our non-monetized impacts using this framework, and we identify a very large beneficial impact. And as a result, we assess it likely that those non-monetized benefits are likely to be substantial enough to move us from medium to high VFM category. So that's how we work our VFM assessments. And I want to take you through that in detail, just so you understand the role of non-monetized impacts alongside monetized impacts. Okay, so if we go into the next slide. This slide talks about the appraisal of developments, residential and non-residential. And the main market-based measure that we use appraising those impacts is land value uplift. Land value uplift basically works by assessing how the market values the new development, what its market value is. Then it subtracts the value of the land in its previous use, and it subtracts the costs of developing the site. And the difference basically is the increase in value that the market attaches to that development. So it might be the number of houses times the price of houses minus the previous cost of land minus the cost of developing that site. That's the increase in value. That's how land value uplift works. So that's our major market-based way of assessing the impacts of new developments. There are also non-market impacts called externalities. So that's our main market-based method for evaluating the economic value of new developments. There are also non-market impacts, in particular things we call externalities, and we'll talk about those later in the session. If we go into the next slide. So chapter 5 talks about one of the major areas which we're focusing on developing, which is the analysis of place-based impacts. So we have a new specific chapter which aims to show how to appraise place-based initiatives to inform levelling up objectives, and it also shows us how we can appraise multiple policies together and reach a single view on their costs and benefits. This chapter is based very firmly within the Levelling Up White Paper. The Levelling Up White Paper identifies 6 capitals which are responsible for or contribute towards areas being left behind, and those are physical, human, intangible, financial, social, and institutional capitals. So what generally happens is that areas will suffer from a deficit in more than one of these capitals, and so really to address levelling up issues, we need multi-strand initiatives aimed at tackling more than one area. And the chapter shows how to do this. It presents an example of a multi-strand program aimed at showing how to address a levelling up problem in a particular area, and it shows how to assess impacts at local and national level. It also includes a number of useful questions to ask when constructing business cases in the strategic and the economic case. Do you want to move on to the next slide? So that's a kind of outline of the main chapters in the appraisal guide. The appraisal guide itself is a living document. So over the next year, DLUP, working with Homes England, will be looking to develop the guidance in several areas. So I've listed 4 key areas here. The first is around levelling up and developing the appraisal framework, particularly for the 6 capitals, and improving our assessment of additionality and displacement. Housing quality and safety is another key focus of the Secretary of State. So we're doing quite a bit of work, particularly working with the English Housing Survey to develop better measures of quality. Developing regional and local levels of local measures of land value uplift is another key area, and that's something we'll be looking to develop. And then there's loads and loads of stuff going on in terms of environmental appraisal, and I think Will's going to talk about that later. So that's an overview of the DLUP appraisal guide. I hope you read it. We'll send around the link. I think it's a good read. And next, Andy's going to talk about the economic research programme that Homes England have got, which is really, really exciting, and will feed into the appraisal guide in due course.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And hi, everyone. Apologies, I've got Teams issues this morning, so I'm working in Office 365. So I can't work out how to stop pinging going on the computer. So there's lots of background noise. I do apologise for that. But yeah, as Andrew said, I'm going to talk a bit about our Homes England economics research programme, provide a bit of context around the objectives, approach and implementation. Yeah, just before we talk about the programme of economic research we've been undertaking, I wanted first to set out a bit of the context in terms of the challenges that we are trying to address through that research programme. Many of you on the call will be aware, some perhaps won't, and that's fine. But economic appraisal, and it's important to stress the clear distinction here from financial appraisal, which we'll elaborate on as we go through the slides. But economic appraisal is, in principle, about the measurement of all costs and benefits in order to decide whether a given project, scheme, programme is worthwhile. That, in essence, that is what we are trying to achieve through economic appraisal, as Andrew has set out through the mechanisms in the DLUP appraisal guide. The results of economic appraisal should never be the only consideration for decision makers. As an economist, I'm often quite biased that there should be a principal consideration, but it should never be the only consideration. There will often be wider strategic or political considerations. But in theory, economic appraisal should enable us to maximise the social value we deliver through the use of public resources. Sounds simple. However, in reality, there are a number of quite significant challenges that some of you will have come across in practice that can prevent economic appraisal being a useful tool, or at least reduce its effectiveness in practice when we apply it against real-world projects and interventions. Now, the slide up on screen at the moment is headed Appraising Housing-Led Interventions, but I think these challenges are very much applicable across different intervention types. Firstly, and a focus for this part of the presentation, is our ability to capture all relevant impacts. In reality, it can be very difficult to accurately measure the full benefits of a project, even when those benefits are a critical reason for the project being proposed, but that doesn't mean they should be ignored. And secondly, that does not mean that they are of less importance to those benefits that we can quantify. The next challenge is around, and there's some high profile examples of this that I think we could all point to, our ability to accurately predict costs. And that's often a common issue across different intervention types, but particularly infrastructure heavy projects. And finally, and very much linked to the previous two challenges, there is a lack of understanding consistency in terms of how the results of economic appraisal are both applied, but how they should be interpreted and used to inform decision making. On to the next slide, please. Now, those sound like quite fundamental challenges, and they are to an extent. I'm very much of the view that economic appraisal, the calculation of benefit cost ratios, etc., is still a very useful tool and key to ensuring we deliver value for money, and is a really good way of auditing how we reach that decision-making process. But it's important to recognise its limitations, and alongside that, continue to work to improve its accuracy. And that indeed is where Homes England's research programme comes in, working closely with Andrew and colleagues in DLUC. So the bad news first, there's a key reason why we face the challenges I've outlined, and some of you will have experienced this in practice. And to be blunt, it's because it's not an easy thing to do. It's a complex process. And to steal a phrase, we're trying to predict known knowns, known unknowns, and indeed unknown unknowns. So it is not an easy thing to do. It is difficult to measure social value, but that doesn't mean we should continuously try and improve the way in which we do that. To address this, there are improvements we can make at the margin. So, for example, how we capture some of those wider non-monetized impacts, but to really crack it, and this is what I want people to remember as one of the key takeaways from today, we need to put proper resources behind comprehensive, rigorous primary research. And that is exactly what we've sought to do within Homes England. Put out on the slide there, we've pulled out some of the kind of key objectives to that work, but as an agency working closely with the department and in consultation with Treasury and other government departments, we've engaged in a 2-year and ongoing programme of research that has sought to firstly improve the understanding and the nature and scale of impacts associated with housing-led interventions, develop methodologies and guidance that allows for the quantification and monetisation of these impacts. So really important that it's not just about providing interesting research reports. These reports can be used in practice, and very much aligned to the work that Andrew has talked about, support that broader improvements in assessment of value for money. If we can flick on to the next slide. Before going into a bit more detail about the approach to the research, I think it's worth spending a moment on what economic appraisal is trying to achieve. And I touched on this at the start, but I've got a quote up on the slide from the HM Treasury's Green Book, which I appreciate many of you perhaps haven't read, but that sets out the kind of guidance to how we apply economic appraisal in terms of public sector interventions. And I think it sums up quite well the purpose of economic appraisal, and it's worth emphasising a few key phrases that are up on the slide. Economic appraisal is concerned with overall social welfare, well-being. Economic appraisal is about looking at all costs and benefits that affect well-being, and economic appraisal applies to the entire population. So there's a comment in the a question in the chat about can we demonstrate that social housing projects, for example, will deliver more benefits than market housing? We'll get to that in the Q&A session, but yes, we can, and we should be doing that, i.e. pulling out the full benefits of a project, not just those related to kind of market, pure economic effects. And just to expand on this, economic appraisal is not financial appraisal. We are not interested, well, we're not solely interested in the financial impact from a monetary perspective. We're interested in the overall net impact on the well-being of society. Now, ideally, we'd measure this impact in units of well-being, but for practical reasons, we use pounds and pence, but this should always be viewed as a proxy for well-being. That is what we're interested in when we undertake economic appraisal. And the reason I'm stressing this is that I think social value is currently one of the more, I'd say, misunderstood terms, specifically in the context of economic appraisals and business cases. I've often heard people say in response to the challenge identified earlier that we should start measuring social value, or we should use metrics such as social return on investment instead of BCRs. We have always been trying to measure social value. The BCR in the context of public sector economic appraisal is or should be the social return on investment. However, the issue has always been our ability to provide robust, credible measurements of social value to fully capture all those impacts. So how then are we trying to set out to do just that? Next slide, please. And there's a lot of text on this slide, sorry, but I think it usefully summarizes the focus of our research. We have the kind of middle oval, and don't worry about reading all the text, but which is the direct, what you might call the direct benefits of the scheme to those who, for example, occupy the new residential or commercial accommodation provided. In the context of housing appraisals, this is often monetized through the use of land value uplift, as Andrew talked about before. And historically, it's often accounted for the majority of quantified or monetized benefits within the scheme's benefit cost ratio. So often in the order of, say, 90% or potentially more of the monetized benefit we incorporate within that metric of value for money. But it's recognised, and it's really important to recognise that this does not capture the full impact of a scheme, particularly, for example, if we're looking at interventions in the context of levelling up or regeneration, where the rationale for intervening is often much broader. This is where the kind of two ovals at the side come in, what we would call the externalities, which is just a fancy word for external impacts. And this is where the gaps in the evidence base currently lie, and where the focus of Homes England research has been. And the work so far on this has actually been quite fruitful. Joe and Will talk more about this, but by including these types of impacts, so particularly those impacts in that left-hand side oval, we have seen project BCRs, benefit cost ratios, increase from below 1, so the BCR suggesting that the costs are higher than the benefits, to being between 1.52, in other words, from poor value for money up to good value for money. So it can have a potentially significant impact. It won't always be the case, but I think this really highlights that if we are able to do this research, we're able to provide those metrics, methods, evidence to understand social value for better. It really highlights the importance of accounting for this within our assessment of value for money. If we move on to the next slide. Now, this next slide is purposely busy, and again, I'm not expecting people to be able to read it all, particularly if you're working off a laptop screen or mobile phone, but the purpose is to highlight that in looking to assess these broader external impacts, there's a lot we could consider, so ranging from agglomeration, productivity impacts to placemaking and sustainability. Now, ideally, I'd very much like to do it all, and that's a kind of long-term target, but we also have finite time and resources, so we've sought to prioritise our research, targeting in those areas that would have the biggest impact. So if we flick on to the following slide. A key part of this has been a comprehensive literature review, working with academics and consultancies to highlight where indeed the gaps lie in the evidence base. The example that's up on the slides relates to housing and productivity, so drawing out some of the ways in which housing can support productivity growth, and that's very much kind of live conversation we're having with colleagues in the Treasury at the moment. But across the different areas of impact, we have sought to identify where those strong causal links exist in terms of the provision of new housing, so that we can clearly attribute impacts to our interventions. We're clear on where those impacts that are not already captured through current methods of measurement, such as land value uplift, so we can avoid double counting and target our resources and research to those areas that will kind of move the dial most significantly. And then tie this back to Homes England's mission and objectives, very much recognising our broader remit in terms of regeneration. And I think, and as Andrew flagged as well, this is where it's particularly relevant in that regeneration and levelling up context, where often the rationale for intervening is not just about the kind of direct on-site benefits, but much more about that broader placemaking impact. If we flip on to the next slide. I won't spend too long on the kind of final two slides from me, as I think you're probably more interested in the actual research itself, which kind of Joe and Will get into. But following the literature review, the research programme was followed a set process. This has involved the Commission of Primary Research, so working with, again, colleagues in department and other government departments, led by the agency's internal economics team, but also working with external industry experts. The completed research has been translated into appraisal methodology. So key principle, as I stressed before, underpinning the work, it doesn't just lead to an interesting report that sits on the shelf that we read and think that's interesting, but can actually be applied in practice. So it can make a difference on the ground in terms of our ability to appraise and assess the value for money of our interventions. The research methodology has been subject to a rigorous review process, so involving peer review by leading independent academics and review by both DLUC and HM Treasury analysts. And then where the research has been finalised, we've then sought to incorporate this into our value for money tools and departmental guidance. So the recently published DLUC appraisal guide includes our work around placemaking impacts, and we're currently in the process of publishing the research reports to sit alongside these. Just flick onto the final slide for me. So finally from me, and it kind of picks up some of the messages I was stressing on the previous slide, the framework around all the research is very much targeted, making sure it's of use to partners such as yourselves and external stakeholders. We want to make sure that people are able to understand and use this research. So as I talked about, each piece of research will include technical reports themselves, the appraisal tools to aid application of the research, guidance checklists, training and non-technical summaries, so we can make sure that even if you are not an appraisal practitioner, you understand this research exists, you have a broad understanding of how it should be applied, and therefore you become an intelligent client in terms of, for example, commissioning consultancies to undertake business cases and what you might expect to see in an economic case. And then we are really open to kind of follow-up conversations following this session with external partners, with people on this call to kind of go through any of these topics in more detail, also kind of the broader guidance that sits in an envelope to this work, and kind of work through that research, recognizing that there's only so much we can kind of talk through within a 2-hour session and a Q&A session at the end, but really trying to make sure that we help partners understand that research exists, what it's trying to do, and what additional ability that gives people to properly kind of measure and make the case for demonstrating social value. What I would kind of start, the kind of final point from me, the work that Andrew set out around that kind of value for money framework, including both monetized and non-monetized impacts, is really, really important. Non-monetized impact will differ by project and type of intervention, depending on what we can measure. But our ability to, as far as we possibly can, to quantify and monetize impacts, to include them in the benefit cost ratio, is really, really important. That process, that methodology, though, needs to be underpinned by robust research, robust evidence, so that we can properly make the case, we can convince decision makers that these impacts are real, and we have a reasonable understanding of what we think the scale of that impact might be. That's it from me. I'm really kind of keen now to kind of pass on to Joe, who's going to go through the research itself and set out some of the results of that research.
Thank you, Andy. It's really, really helpful, and yeah, it's really good to just be able to provide that overview and communicate some of the key messages we want to. So I'm going to now talk about one of the first piece of research, which is about measuring some of the wider impacts on existing communities of housing-led regeneration projects. Next slide, please. As we know, the strategic case for housing-led regeneration in the context of levelling up often revolves around the delivery of external impacts, so the wider area impacts of regeneration, which to date have been difficult to capture and monetize, but we do need to be able to monetize these impacts in order to better reflect the full value of our intervention. So just having land value uplift as the main social gain as it pertains to the private individual occupying the new house is not going to fully capture the impacts and value of regeneration projects. So the circles that Andy just talked through, if we just concentrate on the central circle, we're not going to fully capture our full impact. So the first piece of research is on the placemaking impacts of housing-led regeneration projects. This is in the context of shifting policy towards levelling up, but it was initially prompted by research undertaken by the department on additionality. So the department was undertaking a study on looking at the factors of additionality and the evidence base for those. And it was focused on the displacement of housing-led development. It wasn't seeking to analyse external impacts, but an offshoot of the work was that it identified potential positive external placemaking impacts. So because of this finding, we at Homes England took the opportunity to investigate further. So we commissioned Amiens Consulting to do further econometric modelling of more specific placemaking projects with the aim of better understanding the existence, relationship and magnitude of any wider area impact. So that's how the research originated. So what did we do? Next slide, please. Thank you. So the study, we undertook some primary research. The study used a hedonic pricing methodology to assess the relationship between Homes England's intervention with regeneration objectives and post-intervention trends in house prices. And that's over and above localised growth and controlling for all other variables. The study assessed the effect to which these interventions had influenced house prices in the vicinity of the site compared to houses further away from the site. The study did find that regeneration supply side housing projects are likely to have a positive impact on the surrounding area. And this is due to the amenity gains from the intervention and the social value gain that can be measured through net house price effects. So we're not saying that rising house prices are a good thing, but what we are saying is that they act as a really good proxy for the value of the amenity gain and attractiveness of that area. And that's the spillover effect that into the wider, the wider area that's benefiting local communities. This effect, we have quantified this, and we've got that. We've quantified this, and we've got a table of uplift factors. But the effects do vary by region, size of site, and local rates of development. But they can be applied to the stock capital value of housing in the surrounding community. I will go on to talk about how we define the surrounding community in a moment. But just to note that the departmental appraiser guide does have guidance in there on how to apply this research. We are publishing our research document and the same guidance this month, so please do look out for that as well. But Annex G1 on how to apply the uplift factors. So we'll just have a quick look at the uplift factors. Next slide, please, before we go on to how to measure the surrounding community. So here, as you can see, the uplift factors range from 0 to over 3%, and this depends on the criteria of the intervention. So, for instance, if you've got a development over 500 houses in a medium development in the north, this would be 2.05 uplift to the stock capital value in the surrounding community. And we can add this value to the benefit side of our cost-benefit ratio in our economic appraisal. So they're just the values there. As I say, you can find them in the departmental guide, and we are publishing them this month ourselves too, with the original research report for those of you that are interested in delving into the detail a bit more. So next slide, please. So here we'll go on to just quickly give you I haven't got time to do it at great length, but just to give you a bite-sized example of the methodology for application. So here we define the impact area. The rings you can see around the development radiate out to either 1.5 kilometres or 2.5 kilometres as per the evidence base. And this does depend on the size of your project and the evidence base around that. So in reality, we know it will never be a perfect circle, but it is the best fit approach, using the evidence to say we're not going any wider than the 1.5 or the 2.5. But if you're developing your project, and you've got the local knowledge and the market knowledge, you're probably, you'll be able to determine where the impact is most likely to be felt. So it might be more in the east or the west, and it will never be that perfect shape, but that just gives us a consistency of approach on how to apply. We then calculate the existing capital value of the surrounding housing stock and apply the uplift value from the previous table we just went through with the uplift values in. So as we went through the 2.05 in the area in the north. So the departmental guide, just to say, does give more information on that, and it gives information on where to source capital values, and we can do that pretty easily. If you're working on a project for us, then please do reach out. We can do that for you. I mean, the backdrop to all of this, I'd just like to say, is that it's only a forecast. It's an evidence forecast, but still only a forecast, and you will need to do a sensitivity testing around this and really think it through. We at Homes England are also monitoring and evaluating whether and how the impacts occur, and we will feed that back through to the evidence base and forecasting over time. I think finally, just on this piece of research, another important area to briefly highlight today in the time we've got relates to the circumstances in which the values can be applied. So next slide, please. Thank you. So it's worth going over these, really, really important. So the research gives us the ability to apply the values, but how we apply them is really important. When we apply them is really important. So this slide sets out the key criteria for inclusion. This is where projects have clear placemaking or regeneration objectives. They need to include significant housing and need to be able to demonstrate through the project's theory of change. So in other words, how the investment is actually going to lead through to activities, inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes. What's the evidence-based threading through that theory of change on how the intervention addresses the needs of the surrounding area. We would also expect other key attributes to be present for application. So that's around the prominence of the site and its ability to address negative externalities. And by that, I mean blight, remediation, brownfield land. Its ability, it needs to be able to deliver a range of significant amenity benefits, so open space, active transport, any other recreational uses and employment as well. And it needs to be part of a wider placemaking strategy. So it needs to, within your strategic case, it needs to have the aim to transform a particular place and be of sufficient scale to do that, to restore and enhance perceptions. So if you are, I will just finish off by saying, if you are in doubt, then please do reach out. We have our appraisal inbox at the end of the site. So please do drop us a line and we can help with that. But for now, that's me over. So I will hand over to Will Hardwick, who's going to talk about our redevelopment of brownfield land research, environmental impacts, optimism bias, and wellbeing. So we've got a lot going on, and over to Will. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. As Joe said, there's quite a lot to go through, so we'll be going through fairly quickly. And I'd say that we're planning to publish quite a lot of material on the back of this in the coming months, so lots more detail to follow. So to move on to the next slide, please. So the first piece of work we're going to talk about is around an approach to valuing the amenity impacts associated with removing brownfield land and replacing that with housing-led schemes. So we've been undertaking a piece of work that's applied discrete choice experiment methodology to look to value those amenity impacts associated with removing a brownfield site. So primarily, we've been looking at that the main amenity impact of removing the brownfield site, but the project has also looked at the benefits associated with including other features on the site. So asking people how much they value including new parks or wildlife space and that sort of thing. So what do we mean by brownfield land? So to move on to the next slide, please. So So a couple of photos there that sort of highlight what we sort of think of when we talk about brownfield land. We've been in this project, we've divided it between residential use, commercial use, and industrial. And we've got the definitions below those pictures as well that we used as part of the study. So essentially, we're thinking about empty buildings, surrounding areas that have been poorly maintained, perhaps some antisocial behaviour, littering, graffiti, that sort of thing as well. So generally areas that are going to be in relatively poor condition and with not much of that space being occupied. Next slide, please. So this gives the headline outputs from the study. So there's a lot of material that sits behind this in the main reports that we'll be publishing later in the summer. Essentially, this shows a number of steps to the process of the valuation when you're looking to include these values in economic appraisal. So there's essentially a starting point of looking at the proportion of brownfield within your local area that you're removing. That gives you a base value for the appraisal. Adjustments to that value are then made based on whether you've got a residential, commercial, or industrial site, whether the structures on the site are going to be retained, removed, or they've already been removed, and then an adjustment based on how far from the site a household is and the size of the site that we're talking about. So bringing all of that together gives us a value for the appraisal associated with removing the site. Step 4 in that table are the additional features that I mentioned. So we have a range of values for those features that can be included for a sample of households within the local area. On those, we'd only ever suggest that you include one of them due to the way that the study was set up. But all of this will be detailed in the guidance. I'd say as well that if the table looks complicated to put together, the next piece of work we talk about on environmental impacts has a new tool associated with it. So we have created a tool that helps you to apply this, make it really simple. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is just to highlight that we're in the final stages of getting this piece of work signed off, taking it through a number of sign-off processes in the coming weeks, and hoping to publish it later in the summer to make sure everyone can start to make use of it. We started to test it internally, and yeah, hopefully in the coming months, others can start to use it too to apply it to their projects. Next slide, please. And the next one. So as I mentioned, the brownfield work sits within a wider piece of work we've been doing to look at environmental impacts. So this piece of work has been ongoing for the last 2 years or so with consultants SQW and FTech. So we started the project with a detailed literature review, trying to identify all of the evidence that is available to appraise environmental impacts in the context of housing projects. We used some case studies to test the application of the values that we found from the literature review, essentially trying to work out where there are gaps in the evidence, where the evidence can be improved, and the importance of various features within the appraisal process as well. On the back of that, we scoped a range of potential new empirical research. One of those pieces was the brownfield work that I just ran through. We did other work then in relation to population adjustments. This is essentially looking at what is the impact on the local population associated with building new housing. So where are people moving from and to? And then a lot of work around design standards too. So looking at things such as energy efficiency standards, water consumption, or the quality of blue-green infrastructure on a site. Bringing all of that evidence together has been stage 5, producing a new set of guidance and an associated tool. So we're at the very final stages of that now, having drafts ready, and again, going through the approval processes to get those signed off, ready for publication so people can start to make use of them. Next slide, please. So where does that guidance sit in relation to all of the other guidance that we've been talking about today, and no doubt lots of you are aware of as well? So essentially we've got the Green Book sitting at the top, which is the Treasury's guidance on economic appraisal and business cases. Sat below that, there's a number of department appraisal guides. So we've got things such as transport analysis guidance from the DFT, guidance in the DCMS. 2 of the departmental appraisal guides that are of key relevance here, the DLUC appraisal guide that Andrew took us through earlier, and then enabling a natural capital approach from DEFRA contains lots of detail on the environmental appraisal. So where this guidance sits is essentially between the DEFRA's ENCA guidance and DLUC's appraisal guide, essentially allowing you to apply ENCA in the context of housing in a proportionate way. So providing you with a lot of the assumptions and detail and evidence that you need to be able to apply that for lots of projects. Next slide, please. So what have we looked at within the guidance for environmental impacts? So we've divided the impacts into 3 sections. Those associated with land take, so thinking about changes to land use, those from construction and the construction processes and use of materials, and those from the occupation of homes and the impacts that result from that. I'd note within the guidance that we've tried to provide a comprehensive framework of the impacts. We've included as much evidence to quantify and monetize those impacts as possible, but where that isn't available, we point out where non-monetized impacts may still be relevant. So the framework gives you all of the evidence and points to where you might need to look more broadly for further evidence or to consider things in a qualitative way. Next slide, please. So a little bit of a complicated diagram here, but this explains how the guidance is structured. So essentially, you've got the 3 areas of outputs that I just mentioned of land take, construction and occupation, with a range of outcomes that result from those. So what we have within the guidance is a chapter on each of land take, construction and occupation, and then a section within each chapter for each of the arrows leading to a green box. So essentially run through each of the outcomes for each of the outputs in the same way so that you can use it as a reference source to all of the evidence you need. Next slide, please. So this gives a bit of an indication of one of the routes through that diagram above. So a section from one of the chapters in the draft guidance. What this highlights is that you have the blue box that gives you all the headline information about the methods, the evidence being used, the sources for that information, the assumptions being used, and any other key considerations that you might need to think about, such as key sensitivity testing and that sort of thing. The main text runs through the methods that are being applied and how those calculations work, and then the pink box runs through 2 examples, with those examples running throughout the guidance in a consistent way. What this does is gives you the reference source of how the calculations work, and then you can apply this alongside the tool that we've produced with our consultants. So essentially, this gives you the workings of the spreadsheet tool, but the tool will make it much easier to apply. Next slide, please. So the next slide is a piece of work we've been doing to look at reference class forecasting and optimism bias. So if you're aware of optimism bias and the use of that within economic appraisal, you're probably familiar with the values that are in the HM Treasury Green Book. So we've been using those in Homes England for quite some time, as many do, but we feel that we could improve on that evidence, and so have been undertaking a project to try and improve on that and make use of a better range of evidence. So we've been applying the reference class forecasting methodology with consultants Oxford Global Projects to construct a set of reference classes that are relevant to Homes England projects, building on or making use of the Oxford Global Projects database of over 16,000 past projects. So what this allows you to do is to enter costs in relation to 130 or so cost categories that may be relevant to a sort of a housing-led project. And from those costs, it will give you a bespoke estimate for optimism bias or potentially contingency requirements. So for us on the economic side, we'll primarily be using that to feed economic appraisal in place of the optimism bias uplifts. But we're also considering how we can use that in relation to contingency estimation and requirements, and cross-checking that against QRA methods and things like that as well. Next slide, please. Very good. So a final piece that I'm just going to run you through is about wellbeing and housing for older people. So this is a piece of work that we're currently halfway through. We're just about to go out to undertake the primary survey work and interviews, due to report much later this year, probably early next year. So what this piece of work is looking at is essentially saying where in some circumstances land value uplift may only be reflecting part of the picture in relation to the benefit to the occupants of the homes. So we've started with a piece looking at housing for older people, where we thought that this disconnect between land value uplift and social value may occur to a greater degree due to the nature of that market. So what we've been doing is making use of the HM Treasury Green Book supplementary guidance on wellbeing, thinking about a broad categorization of wellbeing and wellbeing impacts, but also using that guidance to be able to monetize those impacts where possible. So first thing we've done is to look at a housing typology for housing for older people, as indicated by the diagram below. And that's a typology we'll be applying through the primary research in gathering new data. Next slide, please. So first piece of this project that we've run through already is around fiscal impacts. So that piece is literally just completed with the reports being sent over. So this is looking at a broad range of potential fiscal impacts associated with homes for older people, along with that typology that we just ran through. The next stage of the research is going to be looking at well-being more broadly. So this is thinking about, how people who live in older people's housing developments are doing individually and collectively. So that builds on the definitions used by the ONS within their wellbeing dashboard and the Treasury's Green Book supplementary guidance. So we've been constructing a wellbeing framework, as sort of highlighted in the diagram in the bottom right-hand side there. We'll be building on this diagram as we develop the research. So we're just about to go out and do some testing interviews with various groups from the typologies that we ran through. But this is a starting point. So essentially, you've got the various bullet points within that diagram give you indications of the sort of data we'll be looking for in looking at well-being. The key one there when we're thinking about economic appraisal and monetization is the life satisfaction question within those four there that are known as the ONS4. So that life satisfaction question with well-evidenced data behind it allows us to monetize the overall impact. But it's that's not to say the other impacts aren't important. Having data on all of those impacts will allow us to explain why we think people's overall personal well-being is changing. So hopefully that will all come together to give a broad view on what's happening to people's well-being and also allow us to feed that back into economic appraisal. Next slide, please. I think that might be me. Yeah, Joe.
Thank you, Will. Thank you. As Will says, there's just a lot going on. So we've completed a few pieces of research, but we've still got a lot of research ongoing, and we will continue as we are enabled to continue in terms of resources to try and ensure that we're improving economic appraisal and capturing all the full impacts. So I think this is the point now where we move on to Q&A. So we've selected some of the most popular questions, I think, and colleagues have put those in a separate chat for me, so I will go through those. And we're going to ask our speakers and also some members of the economics team to join us in answering those questions. Okay, here we go. I've got a nice table of questions here, but please do shout. So 1 second, first question then. So what does investment mean? Is that the project value? So when we talk about investment, we're talking about the public and private sector investment in a particular project. So you might have a housing-led development project, and that's what we mean by investment, the monetary form of that. So yeah, pounds. And it, what the approval we've got to actually fund the project is how I would term that. Anyone else want to add to that? Okay, we'll go to the next question. Is it possible to demonstrate that building social housing on a site has a higher non-monetized value than building market units? If indeed it actually does. Andy, would you want to come in on that? Because you mentioned it previously, or I can cover that, that's fine. So we were saying, yes, so we can't, it's a complex question. We can't categorically say that one project or one house is higher value than another house, but what we do seek to elicit is not just the market value. Clearly, we're covering all of the social value pertaining to that project, and that's for the private individual and the wider surrounding community. So yes, that's what we're seeking to do, is to articulate and measure all of the impacts, not just those reflected in the market. It's all the non-market impacts to that social value.
And Joe, I was chucked out the call and then joined back, so I might have missed something, but I just wanted to stress that as Joe said, it's a really important point that yes, it's the market value, but that's to reflect the kind of well-being someone gets through the occupation of that home. We also look at the wider, broader social impact. So, for example, through our affordable housing programme, we measure the distributional benefits of providing social housing, and that is incorporated within the benefit cost ratio. So there's an approach to which we monetize those wider distributional effects. We also look at the health benefits of providing affordable homes, and there are broader impacts, and this way it goes to kind of Andrew's point of non-monetized impacts, but there are broader impacts you would expect through affordable housing, high quality homes, for example, relating to crime, educational attainment, etc. Those can be trickier to determine. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do research to try and do that, but where we're not able to, we need to reflect those in the non-monetized impacts and therefore incorporate it into that broader assessment of value for money.
Thank you. Yeah. So the third question then, how do you do the housing project appraisal? Do you use the residual method, and why? Who has answered that in the chat? Do they want to have a first go, and then I will come in on it? So we use it partly, yes.
I could do a quick one, Joe, if you want. I think again, the point of undertaking that appraisal of land values is again to try and understand what the net private benefit has been. So we use a residual land value calculation on the basis that your gross development value, i.e. house prices times quantum development, reflects how much someone is willing to pay for a good or service. And then off that, we net off the cost of delivering that, i.e. build costs, finance costs, etc. So that gives you your residual land value. We then need to reflect the value of the land in its existing use as well. So we'll have a value in its proposed new use, residential, commercial, etc. But it has a value in its existing use, and that might be agricultural, for example, and we need to net off that, hence why we get to land value uplift.
Thank you. Is carbon valued in the appraisal guide? Will, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, short answer is yes. It's included in the Green Book, some supplementary guidance to the Green Book, from DEFRA, Bayes and others. It's in the DLUC guide. And then also it's obviously featured fairly heavily in the environment guidance that I was talking through there, with all of the assumptions from the previous guidance that we run through. So the DLUC guide and the other Green Book guidance, it's all included in the tool. So it's an input. You put in your numbers, it does the calculations for carbon in the background, it does the monetization for you. So yeah, short answer is yes, and it's the detail is all taken through the guidance and tool.
Thank you. Next question, 1 second. Okay, have we looked at how the NHS used the 5-case model and measured the social value for each project as part of the business case completion to assist in measuring social value? Answer is yes, but Will, would you like to expand on that, please?
So I think there's a couple of parts to that question, aren't there? There's one around the 5-case model, which we do apply. We follow Treasury's guidance on the 5-case model, obviously focusing in on components of that model and subheadings that are relevant to housing projects generally, but it's all following the same structure. In terms of following the approach to economic appraisal that you might use in the NHS and thinking about health impacts, it is something that we do quite a lot of, as Andy mentioned, in relation to affordable housing, looking at health impacts there, and then something that we're building on as well as part of the work on environmental impacts, the wellbeing work as well, and some other work that we have we're currently scoping will draw heavily on health impacts, fiscal impacts to the NHS and other things as well, recognising that the two are very closely linked together, particularly when we're thinking about certain forms of housing.
Thank you. Back to the questions. What does hedonic mean? And did you want to just run through that again? We have answered a lot in the chat, but I'll keep coming back to them.
Yeah, I appreciate it's one of those kind of terms economists throw about and then don't explain, such as BCRs, etc. So there's a lot of those. But hedonic in this context basically means where we are using a surrogate or proxy value to measure the benefit of a non-market good or service. So a typical example of that, for example, would be if you were to build a new local park that you weren't charging entrance for, so there's no kind of monetary market value for that park as such. So how do you kind of assess what that benefit of the park is? One way you could do that is look at the increase in local house prices, i.e. After the park is built, how much more would people be willing to pay to live in the area, given that area now has access to a local park. And there's various economic tools you can apply to hold constant for other variables. So, for example, provision of local schools, etc., etc. So you can focus specifically down on what the impact of the local park has been. So just to summarise, it is where we use a market good or service that has a ready measurable value to provide an estimate of the value for something that does not have a readily available market price.
Thank you. I'll take this one then. What about impacts of wider regeneration projects, which include substantial placemaking, e.g. social community, public realm, transport infrastructure, as well as or instead of new homes? And I think that's that directly talks to our first piece of research, where we have sought to measure those using the hedonic pricing, which is accepted by Treasury. It's one of the methods in the Treasury Green Book. You might want to have a look at that, and there is a table in there of it's kind of a hierarchy of research methods. So the hedonic one is reflected in there, and that's what we've used to measure that amenity gain. So the things you're talking about as a proxy for that. So social community, so the public realm. I mean, the transport infrastructure would be reflected, would also be reflecting that, but also could be reflected in other, if there was some substantial transport investment, then that would be reflected in the DFT appraisal. But that's the amenity gain that we are measuring as the wider regeneration impact, and we look at that across the housing and commercial, and also the other methods that we're starting to research, including wellbeing. Andy, did you want to come in on it on the back of that or any of that?
No,
that's probably sufficient. Yep. Right. The next question. Then 1 second. 3% max uplift seems really low. Could you comment, please? I know Urban Splash, for example, would drive something more like 10% uplift as pretty much an immediate uplift. So, I mean, Andy can come in on this as well, but I would say as an initial response to that. So the 3% is pretty significant when you think about it's controlling for all variables. So that's over and above house price, natural house price movement across time as well. It's the stock, the capital stock value of the housing surrounding the property. So once you've got your stock value and you apply your 3% on that, it is pretty significant. So I don't think it's low, but we can discuss that further if you would like to. Andy, do you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, I suppose the point I'd make, Joe, is that first of all, when you work it through and apply it to the impact area, 3% does have a very significant impact, as you said, Joe. Second point I'd make is I always, and I'm not questioning the Urban Splash figure, but I always raise my eyebrows slightly when someone uses a figure such as 5 or 10%. It's very kind of rounded, and my question would be, what evidence is that based on? And that's not to sound kind of too skeptical on this call, but I think one of the issues we've had in the past is that people have applied uplift factors such as this rightly because we feel that we are having these wider area impacts, but actually the evidence to substantiate and back up those uplift factors has been lacking, shall we say. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong to apply them, but it's kind of questionable what that impact has been. I think what's really important is when we do look to monetize and incorporate these benefits in the benefit cost ratio, that the evidence to support that is robust. Otherwise, they don't actually end up influencing decision makers because people are skeptical of the scale of impact that's happening. So we need to be kind of really conscious that the impacts we do, the values we do apply, have rigorous research that sits behind those.
Thank you. Now we've got time for a couple more, I think. So when completing Green Book business cases in the past, there's a need to do a piece of work benefits realization, which social value forms part as social value to one community, has a profile that is different to another community, and this creates the bespoke social value for that project. So is that the question? So albeit it may form part of a strategic KPI, does this form part of the HE economic appraisal? So I can take that one. So we normally do a benefits realisation plan as part of the management case. So that examines how the benefits of the intervention are measured at a local community level. And I guess that really features in the strategic case as well, in terms of thinking about what's your objective, outlining those, and thinking about how this particular project, your project, is going to feed through that theory of change and actually produce the outputs and outcome that you wanted, that is part of your objective. So the economic appraisal assesses the additional social value delivered by the intervention, and assesses value for money at a national level. Although, as Andrew Chosser may set out, we can also undertake place-based appraisal. That might be more appropriate for your project. So it might not align perfectly with your benefits realisation plan, but it examines impacts aligned to the overall outcomes that the project is looking to address. So it does cover that. Would anyone like to add anything else to that? While we just take one last question, and then we can move to wrap up. 1 second. Looking at the ones that have been prioritised.
Can we just take a moment on I've put something quickly in the chat,
Yeah.
but it's one point, and that's around the use of house prices.
Yes, that's a really important one. Yeah.
And the kind of point made that although we're saying that's not the benefit, the kind of research does imply that rising house prices is a good thing. The reason I wanted to flag this is a really important point to make. We are not, for the purpose of this research anyway, interested in the house prices as a benefit. We're interested in the wider placemaking impact that the scheme is having. We are unable to monetize those directly, so we have to use a proxy to do that. Now, what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day is a nicer place for people to live in. That might be due to amenity, might be due to access facilities, for example, access to better housing. When we create that nicer place to live in, then the consequence of it is rising house prices. We are not saying the rising house prices is a good thing. However, we are saying that the rising house prices is an indication or a way of measuring the actual outcome we are trying to achieve. I think we'd all be hard pressed to find a successful regeneration program that hadn't resulted in local house prices increasing. Now, as such, we need to think through, well, what are the knock-on impacts around that in terms of gentrification, affordability, etc. But that does not mean that the research is trying to say that house price increases is a benefit. It's simply a mechanism through which to measure that. You could apply a different methodology to do that. So, for example, the approach that we'll talk through, which is more stated preference survey, asking how much people would theoretically be willing to pay for improvements in redevelopment of brownfield space. Again, we're not asking people to actually pay that money. It is a way of trying to quantify a non-market good or benefit.
Thank you. We'll go to another question then. How is the quality of blue-green infrastructure assessed? Will, are you able to take this question?
Yeah, sure. So within the guidance and some of the background documents on environmental impacts, there's detail included on how to assess the quality of the blue-green infrastructure and the methods that are used there. That's then taken through the environmental appraisal tool that I mentioned, giving you all of the inputs that you need to enter to determine the quality of that blue-green infrastructure. And then that will automatically estimate the impacts associated with that based on your quality inputs that you enter.
Thank you. Okay, I think we are coming to the end now. We've not got much time left, so I think we'll wrap up. But if we can get back on any unanswered questions that have been answered in the chat. It's quite tricky for me to see which ones have been answered, which ones are left, and so sorry if that's not been as seamless and useful as it could have been. But hopefully we've answered the most burning questions, and please do reach out. We've got our economic appraisal inbox. Send us an email, give us a call, and we can help with any other questions and any further discussions or sessions, or further discussions in relation to a specific project. That's normally the most useful way to address these things, because then we can actually take into account the bespoke criteria of your project. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for all your contributions, speakers, and those answering the questions. Really, really helpful. Thank you so much for bearing with us and asking some really great questions. And we will see you soon. Thank you. Thank you, speakers.
Bye.